All right, Advocate, and Land is Ours author, or in this instance, there is also another book. It's called Land Matters, and the author of it, Advocate Ngcukaitobi, he joins me in studio tonight. Advocate, good evening to you, and thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here.
It's good to have you in person once again. Expropriation Act is what we have called you here for. And you say, in the first instance, this is the first topic I'd like to explore with you, you say that this piece of law, this new piece of law, is located in the wrong department, and that is the Department of Public Works and Infrastructure, because this department, in your view, does not carry the mandate of land reform. I want to take you back to what you said last year in your critique of this arrangement. You said, and I quote, "The promise of expropriation for land reform is rendered moot."
Yeah.
Explain that to us.
Yes. I think we need to first just get some clarification of basic concepts, right? So the power of expropriation, right, is the power that is assigned by the Constitution in terms of Section 25 to the state. That power can be exercised in two instances. One is what is called for public purposes, the other is in the public interest. Public purposes generally refers to what the state or the government requires for its own usage. So you can make an example. The government wants to build a school in an area which is densely populated, but there's no land available. It can take your house and put a school. Now, that is a public purpose. We all benefit from it, and we can see why it's in the interest of the government to acquire the land. There is another dimension to expropriation, which is public interest. And that's not always what the government wishes to do, and that's usually for wider benefit, for land reform. So land reform is located under the second category of the uses of expropriation, which is public interest. Now, the problem with this bill, well, it's actually not the problem. The limitation with this bill is that it is not a bill that is intended to address land reform. It is a bill that is intended to empower the state to acquire property in the generic sense, not only land, for the state's own usage. And that much is clear from sections 2 and 3 of the Act.
I note with interest that you still call it a bill. It's now an act.
Yes.
In your reasoning, you go further to spell out the consequences of what you describe to be a bill, as you were commenting on it at the time, a bill structured not to address colonial and apartheid crisis, but instead a design for political football. What's your biggest concern here?
I think that the problem is that at the time the bill was being debated, you could clearly see that there were signals that what was important to the politicians was the symbolic value of this act and not the substantive impact that the act would have. Just like now, I mean, if you look at how the politicians have positioned this bill, I was watching yesterday the Deputy President. The way they've positioned this bill is that this is the instrument for transformation of property relations. But that is just simply a misleading claim. For the most part, more than 90% of this bill, it is a repetition of the 1975 Expropriation Act in relation to its processes that have to be followed in order to effect an expropriation. The changes are actually minor. The changes relate to the introduction of the dimension of public interest. And that specific clause that has got everybody's back up, particularly property owners, which empowers the state in appropriate instances to expropriate subject to nil compensation. Yeah. But the question whether expropriation should happen or not has been part of our legal landscape for hundreds of years. The only difference now is that there are instances that are defined, and those instances include a nil compensation.
We're going to touch on that because it, as you say, it's gotten everybody's back up wanting to opine on it. Before we move on from this particular subject, Do you have a particular position on politicians who are going to want to use this legislation for political point scoring? Do you have some kind of message there?
Yes, I do. I think that the question of land injustice is not political football. It's a question of historical injustice. What we have to address, the ANC was established in 1912 in response to the establishment of the Union in 1910 by white people intentionally to marginalize and exclude native people. The primary reason why the ANC was established was not only to unite Africans, but it was to give them a platform to fight against dispossession. So when you have such a crucial and central element to the struggle, it's actually disappointing that a piece of legislation that should have in fact been central to transformation is simply designed and used as political football. The same message, by the way, to the Democratic Alliance, which seems to have forgotten that actually expropriation is part and parcel of the constitutional framework. And all of the debates that they are now resurrecting about expropriation in principle, about market-based compensation, were debates that were had in 1994. And the DP at the time raised these same debates. The National Party raised these same debates. Sheila Kamara was very strong and articulate during the negotiations, raised the debate. They lost those debates.
Yeah.
So what they've now tried to do is to resurrect them and basically use them as a stumbling block. And even the usage of the government of national unity, essentially to block constitutional reforms.
Is that what you think Dean McPherson is going to do? Because he is a Minister of Public Works and Infrastructure under whose department this legislation falls. Do you worry that he is going to force the implementation of this?
Well, he has no power, right, to stop the enforcement of legislation that has been signed by the president. He has the power to pass regulations, and he could craft those regulations in ways that make expropriation virtually impossible to apply because he is the minister. But ultimately, the final say on whether or not those regulations pass muster is not his. It is up to the judges. So hopefully there will be enough sort of below pressure to make sure that some of the positive elements of this act are implemented.
So let's talk about expropriation as an instrument of land reform.
Yes.
And when we say as an instrument of land reform, in simple language, the transfer of land to the hands of poor people who truly need it. My question to you, do you believe that this is where the country is headed with the Expropriation Act?
You see, the problem, Kole, is that it's very difficult to take the ANC seriously on land reform because it has given mixed messages for the past 30 years. It has always had the power to expropriate land in order to promote the public interest, to resolve the problem of dispossession and landlessness. And so far, it has not shown any seriousness in that regard. That's number one. The second thing is that this is not the bill. This is not the act to achieve land reform. It has still not passed the act that it should pass in order to address land reform. The ANC, you will remember, passed a resolution in its last conference, 2022, in which it said that there shall be a land redistribution bill. We are now in 2025. It's 3 years later. There are no signals of the land redistribution bill, but it is one of their resolutions. So I don't trust that there is enough political commitment to resolve land reform.
All right. So if this is not it, what is the act or what is the bill that ought to be introduced? I think you've just touched on it, but also importantly, the unintended consequences here are what also get people worried. So in a moment, we're going to touch on those. Let's take a break. You're watching News at Prime, and we are in conversation with Advocate Ngcukaitobi, and we're talking the Expropriation Act. Advocate, you've already touched on the land redistribution bill, and you say this is what the ANC had promised at its last conference.
Yes.
But that has not come to pass yet. So that, in your view, is what is needed to move the needle on land redistribution or land reform.
Yes.
But what about the unintended consequences of land being left fallow or unproductive at the hands of the new owners? That is always the problem.
Yes. So, I mean, the problem with that idea is that it presupposes that in the current arrangement, no land is left fallow in the hands of the current owners. And yet, I can ask you to do a basic exercise. You don't have to be a researcher. Take a drive from here to Bloemfontein or from Bloemfontein to the Eastern Cape. You see so much land that's lying fallow. Or go to Cape Town, to the wine farms, so much land that's lying fallow. And it is in the hands of white people. So the concept of acquiring land for speculation is an old capitalist notion. Now, what you really want to do, insofar as land is concerned, is to put land into productive use. Right? The concentration of land, and that's the crisis that South Africa faces, it's that it's got an over-concentration of land ownership to a tiny minority. That is what needs to be disrupted. Because if you disrupt that concentration and allow for wider participation into the land economy, that's where you, in fact, can stimulate economic growth. So this notion that expropriation, land reform is actually bad for the economy is actually self-serving. And it is said by people who, in the current crisis that we currently face, today we face a crisis, despite the fact that we've got a market-driven land ownership policy.
There is a complaint, and it even comes from a former head of state, that you give land to the beneficiaries,
yes,
who previously did not have this. What do? They sell it in order to make money. They have no interest in it. I'm talking about former President Thabo Mbeki. He holds these views himself. I listened to him in previous occasions. So is that where perhaps the problem lies sometimes? Or are black people talking themselves down in many instances?
No, I mean, the fact is that he is wrong in making a general point that every time land is transferred to the hands of black people, it will not be productively used. There are so many instances of land being given to emerging black farmers who are doing excellently, who are involved in the export market, who are involved in resolving the crisis of food shortages in this country. So one cannot make that generic point. There is a different problem, right? There's a different problem, which is the inability of the state to provide what we call post-settlement support, right? Now, that problem must be resolved, but it must not be used as an excuse not to do land reform.
Let's talk about expropriation, which makes provision for what you touched on earlier, for what previously was land or expropriation of land without compensation.
Yes.
It's a point that many people are worried about. Firstly, is this aligned with the country's supreme law, the Constitution?
Yes, it's clearly aligned. What the Constitution provides in Section 25. In fact, a lot of the time people misread Section 25. They regard it as a property clause. You know, it's actually an anti-property clause. The Constitution, Section 25, creates the power to expropriate, right? So that much is clear. But secondly, it also creates the conditions for the expropriation. On the conditions, we've already touched upon public interest and public purpose, so those concepts are now clear. But it makes it subject to compensation. Now, here is where the debate is. So those who insist that there must be money always paid, they focus too much on that clause, you know, subject to compensation. But what they don't do, they don't look at the words that come thereafter, which is what kind of compensation are we dealing with? And that compensation is just and equitable. So which means what is actually the controlling portion in that section is what does justice and equity require in a specific instance. So I usually make these two examples. Take a white man who has received land as a consequence of inheritance But we can trace from the arrival of Jan van Riebeeck that this land was acquired improperly by violence, conquest, theft, everything that is associated with colonialism. But they're not using the land, they're living in Germany. But around that area is a large community that is plainly landless and is in need of housing. In those instances, the bill would enable the state to acquire that land subject to nil compensation because it's not productively used, right? Or it has been abandoned. Someone is just not caring for it at all. Or take a different example where I would say market value is justified. Take the community of Xolobeni. What has happened is the Australians have discovered titanium in that area, right? So they want to mine it, but they can't mine because there's a community living there. But it is a black community that is the subject of historical dispossession. The question is, do you pay them anything? And how do you calculate? So I would say if you want to remove them in order to make way for a mining activity, then you should pay them. Justice and equity will demand that you pay them market value. So that's why it's absolutely important not to have a one-size-fits-all when it comes to compensation, but to have a scale that would ask the question, what does justice and equity require? So what the bill enables, what the Act, you've corrected me there, what the Act enables the judges to do is that they should take my Xolobeni example and pay market-based compensation, and then they should take my German property owner example and pay nil compensation because that is what is required by justice and equity. So it's perfectly compatible with the Constitution, at least on that score.
You've actually explained the three examples that are used in this Act.
Yes.
If it is abandoned,
yes,
acquired unlawfully, or where market value is negligible compared to public benefits.
Yes.
So the EFF, for example, has said Section 25 needs amending in order to effect the question of land reform. Based on what you've explained, does Section 25 need amending?
No, it has never needed an amendment. In fact, Section 25 was one of the most contentious sections when the Constitution was debated. And there were three areas of contention. One was, should the state have the power to expropriate, right? Which the National Party and the Democratic Party opposed and they lost. The second area of contention was, should there be the right of return, right? Where you have lost your property rights, should you be entitled to return? Many constitutions across the world do not have the right of return. Right? But we inscribed it, it's in the law. Right? You are entitled to return to where your forefathers were if you could show that you were dispossessed after 1913. 1913 is a contentious area, but there's a right of return. And then the third one was, in the case of expropriation, what should be the benchmark for the payment? Some constitutions in the world inscribe market value, others do not. We went with those constitutions that do not. And again, even that was contentious. So when Section 25 was therefore adopted, what happened really is that it became the instrument for land reform. That was the purpose behind Section 25. What has happened is that over time, it's been restrictively and conservatively interpreted. But in itself, the goal of Section 25 is to transform property relations.
I've got less than 4 minutes left. Yet so many questions. So with this then, when we conclude on this point, I invoke a political party, the EFF. Let me invoke another one, the Freedom Front Plus, which says it intends going to the Constitutional Court for this new Expropriation Act to be tested there. Do they have a point? Does the Constitutional Court need to test this to see whether or not it is constitutionally sound?
Look, there are problems with the Act that need clarification. There are concepts that are not clear. There are concepts that at face value appear to stand in conflict with each other. But the biggest problem I find with the Act is how procedural it is. It is a highly complex, highly procedural piece of legislation that actually makes it very, very difficult for the state to do its job. I think the design of this Act is so bad that it's going to take a long, long time before the state can do its land, to acquire land even for public purposes. Do they have we have to see what the complaint is. I saw that one complaint was that there was not enough number of provinces that supported it, but that depends on what the evidence is. But I think that most people will say what they're objecting to is the nil compensation part. Now, on that score, I honestly think they will fail.
Very clear there. Final question, practical solutions for land reform. How can we achieve this proper system of land redistribution that is not going to compromise the productive use of land?
Yeah, you know, I always have a problem when there is a qualification that will not compromise the productive use of land, because the assumption is that as soon as you do land reform, you are going to undermine the productive use of land. Whereas we actually have a crisis now. We don't have a productive use of land despite the market-driven system that we've adopted. So what do we need right now? Firstly, we've got land claims. There are 5,800 claims. They need to be resolved. And when I looked at the plan by the government, it looks like we have another 10 years to resolve these claims. We don't have the 10 years. We have to resolve them now. Second thing is the ANC must do what it promised to do. It needs to pass the land redistribution bill. It can pass it. Let's debate it now. And then the third thing is actually simple. It needs to pass a regulatory framework that will define with more precision the question of compensation, because that is what is really getting a lot of debate.
And as I close this conversation, the Expropriation Act, that is now done.
Yeah.
We park it on the side. We saw you last year at the International Court of Justice representing South Africa as a state against the state of Israel, where you argued genocide that was being implemented on the people of Palestine. We now have a ceasefire. Give us your general sense as a lawyer representing a state in Netherlands, and more importantly, perhaps, now that we have a ceasefire, do you hope that it will hold? What's your overall perspective on what has happened in the Middle East?
Well, I mean, for the children of Gaza, we have to hope that it holds. There has been too much killing of innocent people. There's been too much destruction of property. So we have to hope that the ceasefire, firstly, is permanent, and that the children of Gaza can be allowed to return, to reconstitute their lives, and to live normally like we all do. We as black people have been there, and maybe not of the same scale, but we have been the victims of apartheid, victims of marginalization. And so we empathize with what is going on against the Palestinians. It has to end. One can't continue like this. So we hope that this ceasefire will be permanent, and it will in fact translate into an improvement in the human rights situation in Palestine.
Advocate Ngcukaitobi, thank you very much for even allowing us to sway you to that side, because you can't talk about the merits of the case, but at least your perspective as someone who represented the state of South Africa against Israel. Thank you very much for your time. Advocate Ngcukaitobi, a lawyer and indeed a person who has written a book on land matters. All right. Khotso Sello is here with your sports. Stay with us.